and welcome to my next video. If you followed part 1 of this series, then today I invite you to join me as we step into part 2 of the story of the Second World War, a time when the flame of conflict spread far beyond the borders of Europe and reached across the world. When I think about that war, even after so many years, what lingers in my mind is not the sound of gunfire, but the silence that settled between those bursts of violence. That silence carried fear, uncertainty, and the weight of millions of lives waiting for news that could change their fate. At the end of 1940, Britain stood almost alone in the darkening landscape of Europe. Cities were burning, governments had fallen, and an entire continent seemed to be bending under the weight of tyranny. Many people today imagine Britain as completely isolated, fighting in a corner with no one to rely on. But that was never the full truth. No nation fights alone, not in a war that reaches this scale. From the first days of the conflict, the strength of the British Commonwealth and the loyalty of its many territories formed the backbone of its survival. Young men from Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, and Canada traveled across oceans to defend lands they had never seen. The war was no longer a European tragedy. It was becoming a global trial, sweeping from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen plains of Siberia, from the coral islands of the Pacific to the storm-battered shores of Normandy. Every region bore footprints that history would never erase. Beginning in 1941, the war entered a new stage, wider and more complex than anything the world had known. Battles stretched across continents, each one shaping the next. In this part of the story, we will walk through North Africa and the Mediterranean, the vast struggle between Germany and the Soviet Union, the shock of Pearl Harbor and the turning tide in the Pacific, the slow and painful campaign in Italy, and finally the long road that led to Normandy, the collapse of Germany, the atomic bombings, and the fragile peace that followed. When I look back at these years now, I realize that war is not truly about victory or defeat. It is about what humanity learns from suffering and whether we remember those lessons. When Europe fell under the control of the Axis powers, the Mediterranean Sea and the deserts of North Africa became the lifeline of the British Empire. Across those waters and deserts flowed access to the Suez Canal, the critical oil fields of the Middle East, and the supply routes that connected Britain with India and the wider world. If these arteries were cut, Britain would be strangled long before any invasion reached its shores. It was for this reason that Italy, eager to impress and to emulate the rapid victories of Germany, launched campaigns into Somalia, Egypt, and finally Greece. But these assaults, driven more by ambition than preparation, soon collapsed under their own weight. Germany intervened, sending the Afrika Korps under the command of Erwin Rommel. To many soldiers on both sides, Rommel was a figure of almost mythic skill. His forces moved quickly, striking hard and then slipping away before the British could counter. Yet the desert was a harsh master. It punished every mistake, burned every drop of fuel, and revealed every weakness in the long and fragile supply lines that both armies depended on. Victories in the desert were often dramatic, but holding ground was another matter entirely. The Commonwealth forces played a decisive role. Troops from Australia, New Zealand, India, and South Africa stood firmly in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Nowhere was this clearer than at Tobruk, where Australian soldiers endured 8 months of bombardment and siege, preventing Axis forces from capturing a vital port. As the months wore on, the struggle intensified until it reached the battle that turned the tide. At El Alamein, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery halted the Axis advance and began pushing them back across the desert. That victory did more than shift the front line. It restored confidence to the Allied forces and opened the door to a new phase of the war. The success in North Africa allowed the Allies to launch Operation Torch, the landings in Morocco and Algeria, and later the invasion of Italy. When I look back on those days, I often think of the desert itself. In the open sands, a person cannot hide behind trees or walls. Every action is revealed in the clear light of day. Every error echoes across the dunes. And sometimes, it is in the most empty places that we learn the most profound lessons about ourselves and about the choices nations make when the world is at the brink. As the battles in North Africa shifted the balance of power along the Mediterranean, an even greater storm was gathering far to the east. It would soon become the largest land confrontation the world had ever witnessed, a clash so immense that its impact would echo across the rest of the century. I am speaking, of course, about the conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union, ignited by the German invasion known as Operation Barbarossa. In the summer of 1941, before the sun had risen over the borderlands, millions of German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. The sheer scale of the operation remains almost impossible to fully grasp even today. Columns of tanks stretched across the horizon. Infantry divisions marched through fields and forests that seemed endless. The skies filled with aircraft striking deep into Soviet lines. Within days, entire armies were surrounded. Minsk fell, then Smolensk, then Kiev. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured in rapid succession. To many observers at the time, it looked as if the Soviet Union would collapse under the weight of this lightning assault. Yet behind those early victories lay a fatal misunderstanding, a mistake made by Adolf Hitler and echoed by many of his commanders. They believed the Soviet Union would crumble before the winter arrived. They expected a short campaign, a quick triumph, and a defeated enemy before the first snowfall. Because of that belief, they failed to prepare for the brutal winter that awaited them. The German army entered the vastness of the East without proper winter clothing, without reliable supply routes, and without fuel reserves needed for a long campaign. Even worse, Hitler repeatedly refused to allow his commanders to retreat or reorganize when the situation demanded it. He insisted that the army continue moving forward even as machines froze in the cold and soldiers suffered in temperatures far below anything they had known. I have read accounts from veterans who described how the oil inside their vehicles hardened like wax and how rifles jammed in the cold. They spoke of nights when the wind cut through fabric and skin, when frostbite took fingers, and when entire battalions were immobilized simply because the cold had stolen their ability to move. As a historian, I have often wondered how different the war might have been if Germany had prepared for the winter or if its leaders had listened to their commanders. But history does not move according to what we imagine. It moves according to what people do or fail to do. While the German forces moved deeper into Soviet territory, something extraordinary happened far behind the front lines. The Soviet Union undertook one of the most remarkable industrial relocations in human history. Under constant threat of air raids and invasion, Soviet engineers and workers dismantled more than 1,500 factories. They loaded them onto 1.5 million freight cars and sent them thousands of miles eastward beyond the reach of German bombers. Women, elderly citizens, and even school children helped reassemble these factories in Siberia. These new industrial centers soon began producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery in extraordinary numbers. It was a triumph of endurance and organization, and it laid the foundation for the Soviet recovery. That recovery would be tested most fiercely in the city of Stalingrad. The battle there became a symbol of unimaginable brutality and determination. I will not dwell on the violent details because this story does not need graphic images to convey its weight. What matters is understanding what the battle represented. The city lay at a crossroads of the Volga River, and both sides understood its strategic and symbolic importance. The German army pushed forward into the ruins, believing the city would soon fall. But the Soviet defenders refused to let go. They held street by street, building by building, often fighting at distances so close that conventional lines of battle almost disappeared. And then came the turning point. As winter deepened once again, the Soviet army launched a massive counteroffensive. They encircled the German Sixth Army, cutting it off from supplies and reinforcements. For the first time in the war, a major German army found itself trapped. Hitler ordered them to stand fast, promising relief that never arrived. Days turned to weeks, and the situation became hopeless. Finally, surrounded and exhausted, the German forces surrendered. It was one of the most significant defeats the German military had ever suffered. Looking back, Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was a breaking point, the moment when the momentum of the war shifted. Many historians have called it the beginning of the end for Germany, and I believe they are right. Stalingrad was not simply a victory won by weapons or strategy. It was a victory shaped by human will, by resilience, and by the belief that some things are worth enduring unimaginable hardship to defend. When I think of that city, I think of the words often spoken about the struggle. Stalingrad was not a triumph of might alone. It was a triumph of the human spirit. When we shift our attention from the frozen fields of the Eastern Front to the wide expanse of the Pacific, the story of the war takes on a different shape. In the Pacific, conflict was defined by distance, by islands scattered across the ocean, and by the ambitions of an empire that believed it could change its destiny through rapid and decisive force. For Japan, the path to war had been paved years before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The empire found itself trapped in a long and exhausting conflict in China, and that struggle consumed vast amounts of manpower and resources. Factories ran slow, supplies tightened. The empire's fuel reserves fell dangerously low. Japan lacked the oil, rubber, and steel needed to sustain its military machine, and those resources existed in abundance only to the south, in Southeast Asia. But there was a problem. To reach those resources, Japan would have to move through waters controlled by the British and the Americans. And the Japanese Navy, despite its skill and discipline, understood that an extended fight with the American Pacific Fleet was a risk they could not afford. History often turns on decisions made under pressure, and Japan made one such decision. If conflict with the United States was unavoidable, then better to strike first with speed and surprise before the Americans could react. And so came the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941. Many people today remember the images of burning battleships and the shock that rippled across the American public. But as a historian, I tend to focus on something less obvious. The attack, though devastating, was not complete. Japan sank several battleships, but they did not destroy the American aircraft carriers because they were not in port that day. They did not destroy the repair facilities, which meant the fleet could recover. They did not destroy the massive fuel reserves, which meant the American Navy could continue operating almost immediately. It was a bold strike, but it lacked depth. It was designed to shock, not to sustain victory. And wars, as we have learned many times, are not won in a single morning. Still, in the weeks that followed, Japan moved with astonishing speed. Their forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia like a tide. Guam fell. The Philippines fell after a desperate struggle. Hong Kong collapsed. Singapore, once considered an unbreakable fortress, surrendered in one of the most dramatic defeats in British military history. Japanese troops advanced through the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. The empire seemed unstoppable. But behind that rapid expansion was a human cost that remains deeply painful to recall. In many occupied territories, civilians faced harsh treatment, forced labor, and severe restrictions. As a historian, I speak of these events with caution and with respect for the people who lived through them, because war often leaves scars that last for generations. For the people of those regions, the conflict was not only a story of armies and strategy, it was a story of survival, of hardship, and of enduring hope. Yet, even as Japan expanded, the seeds of its challenge were already growing. The United States, shaken but not broken by Pearl Harbor, mobilized with remarkable speed. Factories across the country turned out ships, aircraft, and equipment in numbers the world had never seen before. Intelligence units improved their ability to track Japanese movements. And then came the battle that forever altered the course of the Pacific War, Midway. At Midway, American codebreakers gave the Navy vital insight into Japanese plans. When the battle began, the United States struck with precision. By the end of the confrontation, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers had been sunk. These carriers were not just ships. They were the heart of Japan's naval power, and losing them meant losing the ability to sustain large offensive operations. Some historians call Midway the turning point of the war in the Pacific. I agree. It was not only a military victory but a psychological one. It showed that Japan's early triumphs had been built on speed, surprise, and momentum factors that could evaporate once the enemy recovered. As I reflect on this chapter of the war, what stands out most is a simple truth. Japan won its early victories because it moved faster than anyone expected. But speed alone cannot win a long war. In the Pacific, distance, production, and endurance mattered more. And history teaches us that while speed may open the first door, only endurance can carry an army through the final one. In the end, Japan learned a lesson that many nations have faced before. War is not a sprint. War is a test of stamina, of resilience, and of the ability to withstand hardship long after the first victories have faded. As the tides of war shifted after breakthroughs in North Africa, the Western allies were faced with a profound question: where to strike next? Europe, at that point, was a fortress dominated by Germany. But even fortresses have weak points, and the Allies believed the soft underbelly of Europe lay in its southern reaches. That belief led them to the rugged mountains and ancient towns of Italy, a place where geography, politics, and history intertwined to create one of the most complex campaigns of the war. The decision to attack from the south began with the invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943. It was a bold and ambitious plan. The Allies launched a massive amphibious assault on the island, hoping to weaken German control of the Mediterranean and force Italy out of the conflict. The campaign progressed steadily, and soon the Allies moved from Sicily onto the Italian mainland. What they found there was not a united front, but a country whose political foundation was crumbling. Years of hardship, military failures, and internal dissatisfaction had eroded the strength of Benito Mussolini's government. Before long, Mussolini was removed from power, arrested, and Italy's leadership attempted to negotiate an end to the war. But if the Italian government was ready to step away from the conflict, Germany was not willing to let the peninsula slip so easily from its grasp. In a swift and calculated move, German forces occupied northern and central Italy, freeing Mussolini and installing him as the head of a puppet state. In doing so, Germany assumed full responsibility for defending Italy, a task that would drain its resources and stretch its army thinner than ever before. What might have been a straightforward withdrawal of a weakened ally instead became a prolonged and grueling struggle. For the soldiers who fought through Italy, the campaign was defined not only by combat, but also by the land itself. Italy is a country shaped by mountains, valleys, and narrow passes. The rugged spine of the Apennine Mountains runs through its center like a natural barrier, and during the war, it became a chain of defensive lines that slowed Allied progress to a crawl. One of the most infamous of these lines was the Gustav Line, fortified by German troops who used the terrain to their advantage. Progress was slow, and every mile demanded patience, coordination, and determination. Among the many challenges the Allies faced, the battles around Monte Cassino stand out in memory. Although I will not go into graphic detail, it is important to understand that this was a test of endurance rather than a clash of raw force. The ancient abbey atop the mountain became a symbol of the larger struggle, a place where history, culture, and conflict merged. The Allies faced a combination of difficult weather, steep ascents, and well-prepared defenses. Weeks stretched into months, and the fight became a symbol of how difficult the Italian campaign truly was. Victory did not come quickly or easily, but eventually the Gustav Line was broken, and Rome would be taken in the summer of 1944. What is often misunderstood about the Italian campaign is that its value lay not only in geography, but in timing. The slow progress forced Germany to divert troops, equipment, and leadership to the south. Every division sent to Italy was a division that could not be deployed against the Soviets or held in reserve for battles in France. And while the Allies struggled through Italian hills and valleys, they were learning valuable lessons in coordination, logistics, engineering, and combined operations, all of which would be essential for the invasion of Western Europe. The campaign in Italy was never meant to be the final blow of the war. It was part of a larger design, one that would eventually open the gateway to Normandy and the liberation of Western Europe. In that regard, Italy served as a stepping stone, a place where momentum was built and where German confidence was slowly chipped away. The peninsula became a proving ground for Allied cooperation, a theater that forced adaptation, patience, and determination. When I think of the soldiers who pressed northward through those mountain passes, I am reminded of something I often tell my students. Not every victory is won in a moment of dramatic triumph. Some victories are earned inch by inch through persistence, rather than spectacle. The winding roads of Italy taught the Allies that lesson well. They revealed that the path to success is not always quick, nor is it always glorious. But when a nation remains committed, when it refuses to yield to the weight of difficulty, then even the steepest climb becomes possible. In the end, the campaign in Italy opened a door. It was not the final door of the war, but it was the one that led the Allies to the very heart of Europe. As the long struggle of the war entered its final years, the question facing the Western Allies was how to take back a continent still held tightly in Germany's grasp. The answer lay across the English Channel in a place called Normandy. But getting there required not only courage, but also deception on a grand scale. Before the first American, British, or Canadian soldiers set foot on the beaches, the Allies created an elaborate plan designed to fool German intelligence. Through fake armies, inflatable tanks, and carefully crafted radio traffic, they convinced the Germans that the invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. It was a remarkable achievement, one that saved countless lives by drawing the enemy's attention away from the true landing site. Then came the 6th of June, 1944. To many people, that date is simply known as D-Day, but to those who study history, it represents the moment when the Allies placed all their hopes on a narrow stretch of coastline in northern France. Paratroopers descended through the darkness the night before, spreading confusion behind German lines. Naval guns thundered at dawn, and waves of landing craft carried soldiers toward Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. The cost was heavy, especially on Omaha Beach, where the German defenses were formidable, but step by step, through determination and sacrifice, the Allies secured a foothold. By the end of that day, Europe had its doorway to liberation. From that moment forward, Germany's collapse became increasingly inevitable. Yet the end was neither simple nor swift. Late in 1944, Germany launched a final, desperate offensive through the Ardennes forest, a surprise attack meant to split Allied lines and force a negotiated peace. This became known as the Battle of the Bulge. For a time, it created confusion and hardship among the Allied forces, but determination held firm, and the German advance was pushed back. It was Germany's last major attempt to change the course of the war. Beyond that point, the walls of the Reich began to crumble. As Soviet forces advanced from the east and the Western Allies pushed from the west, Germany could no longer sustain the fight. Berlin became a symbol of the war's final chapter. In the spring of 1945, Soviet armies surrounded the city. Adolf Hitler, isolated in a bunker beneath the shattered capital, saw his ambitions turn to dust. Soon after, he took his own life. Not long after that, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Europe's war had ended, but the conflict was not over. Across the Pacific, another struggle continued. American forces moved steadily across the ocean, island by island, through places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These battles were marked not by swift maneuvers, but by determination and endurance. Japanese forces held their ground with belief and resolve. And as the war pressed closer to the Japanese homeland, desperation fueled new tactics, including kamikaze missions that reflected the heavy strain of the conflict. The United States faced a painful calculation. An invasion of Japan would cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. It was in that context that the American government made a decision that remains one of the most consequential in human history. In August of 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mention this with deep respect for the memory of those who suffered and without graphic description. The devastation was immense, and it left wounds, physical, emotional, and historical, that still shape our world. In the aftermath, the Japanese government accepted the terms of surrender. The Pacific War, at last, was over. Victory brought not only relief, but also responsibility. A new world had to be built from the ruins. Germany was divided into 4 zones administered by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. Japan underwent 8 years of Allied occupation, during which its society, education system, and government were profoundly reshaped. And rising from the ashes of global conflict were two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, each with its own vision for the future. Their competing ideals would soon define the Cold War, a new era shaped not by open battle, but by tension, suspicion, and the race for influence. As a historian looking back across the broad landscape of these events, I find myself returning to a single reflection. Although World War II ended in 1945, the questions it raised remain with us. How should nations wield their power? What responsibility do leaders bear for the choices they make? And what is the true price humanity pays for peace? These are not questions for textbooks alone. They are questions for all of us. They remind us that history is more than a record of battles. It is a guidebook, one written in the hope that future generations will listen, learn, and choose a wiser path.